Hey everyone, and welcome to another Explainer. Today we're diving into a literal watershed moment in the history of artificial intelligence. You know, if you've ever found yourself wondering how computers suddenly got just incredibly good at recognizing what's in a picture, well, the answer points straight back to a single revolutionary model from 2012. We're talking about AlexNet. This was the absolute hero that stepped up, solved an almost impossible computer vision challenge, and honestly, it fundamentally changed the trajectory of AI forever.
Okay, let's dive into this. To really appreciate the breakthrough, we first have to understand the nightmare that was the ImageNet challenge. So before 2012, teaching a computer to simply tell the difference between, say, a leopard and a motor scooter, it was incredibly difficult. The gold standard for testing this was ImageNet. We're talking about a massive, sprawling dataset of 1.2 million high-resolution training images, and they were spread across 1,000 distinct, often very similar object categories. The sheer scale and the visual complexity of this whole thing was just a total nightmare for traditional machine learning algorithms.
Well, you see, older models, like the classic Linnet from back in the late 90s, they were brilliant, absolutely, but they were really shallow. They had maybe 60,000 parameters, and they processed these tiny little 32 by 32 pixel images. But ImageNet images? Those were over 200 pixels wide. Plus, older networks relied on these mathematical rules, activation functions known as sigmoid or tanh. And the problem was, when you tried to stack many layers together to handle those bigger images, these functions caused a major issue called the vanishing gradient problem. Essentially, the learning signal would just fade away to nothing, like a bad game of telephone, as it passed back through the layers, causing the training to just completely stall out. The models flat out failed to learn.
All right, moving on to Section 1, the anatomy of AlexNet, inside the pattern-finding factory.
To truly wrap our heads around how AlexNet solved this, it really helps to think of it as an incredibly efficient 8-stage factory assembly line. First, the raw material enters, right? That's your 227 by 227 pixel color image. Then it hits the factory floor, and these are the 5 convolutional layers. Think of these layers as specialized workers. The first workers, they're just looking for really simple edges and colors. The next workers take those and combine them into textures, and the next guys combine those into distinct shapes like wheels or ears. Finally, all that process data goes all the way up to the boardroom, the 3 fully connected layers. These layers look at all the high-level features extracted by the factory floor, and they make the final definitive call on which of the 1,000 categories that image actually belongs to.
So let's look at Section 2, the secret weapons, 3 game-changing innovations.
You see, just building a deeper factory honestly wasn't enough. The whole architecture relied on this trinity of secret weapons. You had the ReLU activation function for a massive speed boost, dropout for strict quality control, and data augmentation, which basically acted like an advanced training simulator for the model. First up is ReLU. It stands for Rectified Linear Unit, and it is beautifully simple. Basically, if an input is negative, it just turns it to 0. If it's positive, it lets it pass through exactly as is. So the crucial point here is that unlike those older sigmoid functions that squash numbers down and cause the gradients to vanish, ReLU allows that vital learning signal to flow freely through a very deep network. This surprisingly simple mathematical switch made training several times faster, and critically, it actually allowed these deep layers to converge.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the concept of dropout. When a model is this incredibly large, it tends to just memorize the training images rather than learning general applicable patterns, and that's a huge problem called overfitting. To fight this, AlexNet randomly turned off or dropped out 50% of the neurons in its dense layers during every single training step. Imagine if half your factory workers were just randomly sent on a coffee break every hour. The remaining workers couldn't just rely on one specific guy to do a specific job, right? They all have to learn the core skills. This clever trick forced the network to become incredibly robust.
The third weapon was data augmentation. Because, even with 1.2 million images, a giant network is always hungry for more data. So the team essentially created a training simulator. They took the original images and artificially expanded the dataset by randomly cropping them, flipping them horizontally, and just slightly altering their colors on the fly. Because of this, the model rarely saw the exact same image twice, which vastly improved its ability to cater to entirely unseen images out there in the real world.
But all of this architecture and all these clever innovations were needed to manage an incredibly massive number, 60 million. That is the number of learnable parameters, the microscopic dials and knobs basically, inside AlexNet. Processing a model of this sheer, unprecedented size was virtually impossible on the standard computer processors of the time.
So, to act as the computational engine for this absolute beast, the researchers turned to graphics processing units, or GPUs, specifically a pair of NVIDIA GTX 580s. Before AlexNet, neural networks were largely trained on CPUs, which was, let's face it, painstakingly slow. But by splitting the network across two GPUs, they were able to train those 60 million parameters in about 5 to 6 days, and this was a game changer. It proved once and for all that deep neural networks could be feasibly and efficiently trained on GPUs.
Section 3. The Aftermath. Sparking the Deep Learning Revolution. When the fully operational AlexNet actually entered the 2012 ImageNet competition, the aftermath was an absolute earthquake in the tech world. It didn't just win, it completely obliterated the competition. It achieved a top 5 error rate of just 15.3%. The runner-up, which keep in mind wasn't using deep learning at all, had an error rate of 26.1%. That is a staggering 10.8% margin of victory. It was undeniable, rock-solid proof that deep convolutional neural networks were the future. And this brilliantly illustrates the shift. Notice the sharp downward plunge on the error rate chart, starting right there in 2012. AlexNet proved that you could achieve state-of-the-art results on massive, large-scale tasks using purely supervised deep learning. It set the blueprint for the entire industry. As you can see, every single year after 2012, researchers took those foundational ideas of AlexNet, the GPUs, the ReLUs, the deep layers, and they just pushed them further and further, leading to wildly deeper models like VGGNet and ResNet, which had dozens or even hundreds of layers, eventually driving error rates down into the single digits. So AlexNet was literally the spark that ignited the modern AI revolution. It proved that if you give a deep network enough data and enough compute power, it can achieve the seemingly impossible. Which really leaves us to wonder, as computing power continues to scale up and radically new architectures are being designed today, what will be the next AlexNet-level breakthrough that completely redefines what machines can do? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep exploring.